This is WFYI News Now. It's July 18th, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, Indiana farmers set a record for the most acres of cover crops planted. What the major focus of Democrat Destiny Wells' campaign for Attorney General will be. How U.S. Senate candidate Jim Banks used his time speaking at the Republican National Convention. And some Hoosiers are still unsure of where their access to Medicaid service stands.
You're dealing with some very vulnerable people right here. And my mom's lucky she's got family to try to supplement. Some of these patients have nobody to advocate for them.
Those stories are coming up, but first, a new ordinance would require Indianapolis pet owners to register dogs that are not spayed or neutered. As WFYI's Jill Sheridan reports, the measure aims to ease animal overpopulation in Marion County and stop backyard breeding.
Indianapolis Animal Care Services has been well over capacity at its aging shelter for years. This new proposal aims to help stem the intake by requiring owners to register dogs and agree to proper vet care. Animal Care Officer Michael Stockton says unregulated backyard breeding is responsible for thousands of uncared for dogs and is a public safety issue.
These are the dogs that end up, running loose in our streets, attacking citizens, getting shot, hit by cars. They're the dogs that end up in the abuse, neglect, abandonment situations that we investigate.
Dozens of animal care workers and volunteers attended the meeting of the Metropolitan Economic Development Committee this week to show support. The proposal passed out of committee and now heads to the full council. I'm Jill Sheridan.
For the third year in a row, Indiana farmers have set a record for the most acres of cover crops planted, more than 1.7 million acres. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Rebecca Thiel reports cover crops are planted to keep the soil from eroding away, which can pollute Indiana's streams and lakes.
Shannon Zizula is the state resource conservationist for Indiana through the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service. He says cover crops have a lot of benefits for farmers, too, like improving soil health and helping it hold water. Zizula says the state has seen a steady increase in cover crops over the past 12 years, largely because of state and federal partnerships to educate farmers.
And then also farmers doing that, the neighbors seeing the benefits and them speaking to the benefits themselves to other farmers. We've just seen more and more farmers wanting to try them and then having success when they do.
And Zizula says now is a good time to experiment, even just on a few acres. The Inflation Reduction Act gave more than $18 billion to programs to help offset the cost of implementing conservation practices. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Rebecca Thiel.
Workers' rights are a major focus for Democrat Destiny Wells' campaign for Attorney General. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith reports Wells secured the nomination last weekend at the Democratic State Party Convention.
Wells says the Attorney General's office has been falling short for years on protecting workers. She says under her leadership, there would be a focus on labor trafficking, worker misclassification, and wage theft.
Become more of a people's attorney in addition to being the government's attorney, too.
The biggest hurdle Wells likely faces in the campaign is reaching Republicans who vote straight ticket without looking at individual races. She says she's learned from her unsuccessful 2022 Secretary of State campaign against Diego Morales.
They'll like my profile, they'll like what I stand for, and then when I tell them in 2022 they voted for my opponent, Diego Morales, they'll actually say, no, I didn't. And I'll say, yes, you did, because you stopped reading names.
Wells faces incumbent Todd Rokita in this fall's election. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
And U.S. Senate candidate Jim Banks used his primetime speech at the Republican National Convention Tuesday to lavishly praise former President Donald Trump. Banks spoke during an hour dedicated to Senate candidates and called Trump the greatest and strongest president of his lifetime.
We need President Trump back in the White House if we're going to make America great once again.
Banks touched on his own background, born in a trailer park, the son of a factory worker and a nursing home cook. He briefly mentioned policy focusing on immigration and mass deportation.
If you came here illegally under Joe Biden, you're going back to where you came from under Donald Trump.
Banks' opponents in the open U.S. Senate race are Democrat Valerie McRae and Libertarian Andrew Horning. And for our final story today, some Hoosiers are still unsure of where their access to home and community-based services through Medicaid stands as the state starts working through its waitlist. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Abigail Ruman reports some families say the lack of communication from the Family and Social Services Administration is making it difficult to navigate decisions around care.
Thousands of new slots for some Medicaid waivers opened on July 1st, but FSSA plans to only process about 900 members per month. This means that even if there is a slot available, it could take over a year for some members to be placed in the programs. Colleen Jacobson's mother was approved for the Pathways waiver back in April, around the time the state implemented the waitlist. She says her family is having to make difficult decisions about care without much information on how FSSA is working through the waitlist.
You're dealing with some very vulnerable people right here. And my mom's lucky she's got family to try to supplement. Some of these patients have nobody to advocate for them.
While the family can move Jacobson's mother to another type of care, that could have a negative effect on her health. But not starting the process means having to take on the financial stress of that care month to month while they wait. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Abigail Ruman.
The FSSA says it will continue to provide regular updates on the waitlist as it processes members. And that's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by Drew Daudelin with support from the news team at WFYI and public media journalists across the state. Our news director is Sarah Neal-Estes. Kendall Antron produced our music, and I'm your host, Abriana Herron. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.